Thank you so much. Okay. Yeah, well, Kai stole my line, my opening line about how many people are going to be eligible to participate in an election in 2024. You said 50%. I thought it was 40%. Anyway, a lot of people. A lot of.
50%.
Okay.
So I'm not sure if that's credible source,
yeah.
though.
I'm a journalist, so
okay,
come on.
I'm sorry.
Anyway, in any case, it's a significant number, and this is a very significant and historic year for democracies all over the world. The scale of this sort of confluence of elections, some of which are already happened, some of which happened, actually in the last part of 2023, including Slovakia, Poland, Argentina, and the Netherlands, and then recently Taiwan, and then Indonesia this week. It's a lot. And the backdrop for all of these elections is the fact that before we even talk about AI, which is what we're going to be talking about in this panel, we are already, the situation is already that we have a pretty troubled and troubling information ecosystem. I don't need to tell anybody in the room about that. The reasons are extremely varied. We don't need to get into that today, but here we are. So this year now, you take that already baseline of a troubled information ecosystem and you layer AI onto it. And that contributes to a year of extreme complexity for those, for all of us who are interested in protecting democracies. And then sprinkled on top is a lot of hype, a lot of hysteria, and a lot of misdirection about what are the things about AI we should worry about. So we're going to unpack all of that with this incredible all-star panel. I will just mention also that at Aspen Digital, we are a program of the Aspen Institute. We are focusing heavily on that this year. And Kai mentioned the articles that are in your programs. I think towards the back is one co-authored by myself and also Josh Lawson, who's the director of AI and Democracy for Aspen Digital, in which we present what our research has shown are the 7 risk factors. So go ahead and take a look at that later. But in the meantime, let's focus on this amazing panel. So all the way at the end, we have David Agranovich, the Meta's Director of Threat Disruption. Prior to Facebook, or Meta, sorry, I guess it was Facebook when you started. David was part of the Director for Intelligence at the National Security Council in the White House, where he led the U.S. government's effort to address foreign interference in democratic systems and elections. So that has prepared you well. Then we have Theo Bertram, TikTok's Vice President of Government Relations and Public Policy for Europe. He oversees all of TikTok's government relations and external functions in the UK, Israel, and throughout Europe. Prior to TikTok, Theo was in similar roles at Google. Then Olga Belogolova. I actually never asked you how to pronounce your last name, but since, yes, as you know, I speak Russian, I just pronounced it the Russian way. Was Director for Emerging Technologies Initiatives at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Prior to that, she was it was Facebook then, led policy for countering influence ops and earlier focused there on threat intelligence work on Russia and Eastern Europe. Sandra Joyce, the VP of Mandiant Intelligence at Google Cloud. She has been the cybersecurity leader at Mandiant since 2017. That, of course, predates the Google acquisition. Sandra is also, and I love this fact, an officer in the U.S. Air Force Reserve, faculty member at National Intelligence University, and a proud member of the Aspen Cybersecurity Group. Thank you, Sandra. And finally, Nick Beim is did I pronounce it right? Beim. I should have asked that before I got on stage. Nick Beim is a partner at VC Venrock. He focuses primarily on AI, software, fintech, and defense. Nick serves on boards of directors of several companies, including Dataminer. If you looked previously at your programs, you notice we were supposed to have Ted Bailey here from Dataminer. He could not make it in time, but we're thrilled to have Nick with us. Dataminer, as you know, is an AI platform that identifies critical breaking information from publicly available data. Okay, so we've got just the perfect people to talk about this. Olga, as the only person who is not currently working in or investing in a tech company, I'm going to start with you. So I want you to just sort of set the stage for us on what are the things that we should be worried about right now, and sort of separate some of the hype from reality in terms of risk?
Of course, and thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful being here. It's actually my first time at the Munich Cybersecurity Conference, so it's wonderful to be here. I'm looking forward to a lot of the conversations. So let's talk about the hype before we separate it from the reality. So take a look at some of the headlines that you see around this topic, particularly around disinformation, influence, and artificial intelligence and the elections of 2024. The headlines will read, "Elections are colliding with disinformation and AI like never before. There is a coming flood of disinformation. This is an apocalypse," right? A lot of apocalyptic terminology if you read stories about this topic. That's a little bit concerning, particularly for me. I've spent a lot of time studying Russian influence operations throughout history, and their particular intentions. Often we misconstrue what they're intending to do. We don't always know, but historically, if you look throughout the Cold War and to the present day, sometimes the intention of influence operations is not to get anyone to believe anything in particular, but it's to get people to believe nothing at all. So you can take those headlines into that context and then think about how that might play into our information environment, how we might be perceiving the world around us because we think that we cannot trust anything because artificial intelligence is going to change it all. Now, let's rewind a little bit back to, we're setting the stage right now, but let's rewind back to 1988 when Photoshop first came out. Some of the conversations that were happening around that time were quite similar to the ones we're having today. And there was a lot of scare around what is Photoshop going to do to trust and whether we're going to be able to trust images anymore. And certainly, Photoshop has been used by threat actors and others to sort of deceive and manipulate, but that doesn't mean it, fundamentally changed the entire information environment and we couldn't trust anything at all. Let's rewind even further back to 1440 when the printing press was invented. And let's talk about, within the 100-year period after the printing press was first invented, there were, changes that were made to society because of the printing press. People were publishing pamphlets, including things like the 95 Theses, changing religion and the history in many, many ways. And that scared a lot of people who were in power. And so they also decided to regulate. There was a French king that threatened people sentenced to death by hanging for using the printing press at all. So all of that context, right? Why am I talking about history? I think it's important for us to learn from it, because if we look back to 2016, let's take a guess. How many studies, by show of hands, do you think there were that studied the impact of influence operations in 2016? That actually studied the impact? One. There have been a lot of incredible research from researchers at technology companies and other places that have delved into the impact of influence operations on elections. But it's really hard to actually study the impact of influence operations, right? There's bad proxies for it. You can, try to measure the number of followers someone has or how much engagement they got. But that also doesn't take into account the rest of the information environment. And we're going to an election year now where one of the most recent prominent examples of AI being used was a robocall, which was disseminated over a telephone. We're not measuring that. So let's try to distinguish the hype from the reality. Happy to talk more about it, but I want to make sure everyone else on the stage has more time to discuss.
Thank you. That's a great setup. And yet, AI does bring some risks, which we're going to talk about. Nick, I want to turn to you. So, your purview across the entire risk-based technology industry, as your role in a VC, an investor in so many of these companies. Which institutions tell us a little bit about how the companies that you're working with are looking at this risk and understanding what those risks are?
Sure. Maybe just a high-level contextual point. I think something that's a little bit different about AI today than past threats that AI posed is how quickly it's advancing. So today, there are tools available online where anyone in this room could mimic anyone else on a Zoom call or on an audio call pretty effectively. There are models, not even on the dark web, but just on the internet, to mimic the voice of a lot of famous figures. And the digital forensics required to figure out which are deep fakes and understand the context of which are malicious are progressing more slowly currently than the AI is. So it's always hard to predict the future, but this may be different. There may be some very serious cases. I think people probably are familiar with the Zoom call in Hong Kong, where a senior executive at a Fortune 100 company did a Zoom call with the CFO and 3 of his colleagues, and it turned out they were all fakes, and he wired $25 million to an account they told him to wire to, and it fooled someone who would otherwise be quite aware. So the technology is progressing quickly. On the question you asked with regards to institutions, I say there are 3 problems that are part of deepfakes. There is the detection problem. As I said earlier, detection is not enough. Most images, most videos we see today are at least 2/3 fake anyway. They make us look better. There's sort of automatic improvements that many platform companies will make when you take the photo. You need to understand the context to understand if it's malicious or not. And then there's a propagation problem. My view is that the most serious problem for elections in particular is the propagation problem. And it's great to have such a robust set of figures who help control propagation and set the rules for propagation. Mark Twain once said that lies can travel halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to get its shoes on. I think that's the problem that we're likely facing. And in parallel to that problem, I think sophisticated attacks on enterprises, on governments that are using spoofed voices, spoofed videos, that may pop up in unexpected places will affect all of us. On the question of institutions, there are some startups that are starting to address the technology problems of detection and understanding. But the challenge is there is not yet a big market to go after, so it's limited funding. There are 4 or 5 startups. Once this starts to hit the enterprise and you know, more Fortune 100 companies get attacked, I think you'll see a flood of money coming into the space, and the technology will get a lot better. One issue that concerns me from the outside, and I know many of the platform companies are seeking to work together to address this problem, is that like protecting democracy, protecting against deepfakes doesn't hurt the revenue of platform companies. And so I believe there will be a lot of focus on it, but not the same degree of focus as if it fundamentally threatened their business models. So I think there's an economic problem to solving deepfakes, and it's going to take cooperation of the platform companies with the government and technology startups, just because they tend to have the fastest iteration of new solutions to solve the problem. I think it'll take 5+ years.
Okay, well, interestingly, we have 3 platforms here represented who may have something to say about whether those incentives are aligned or not. So we will come back to that. We have not forgotten that question, folks. But before we do that, I'm going to ask a couple of more things. And one clarification: I noticed that you used the term deep fakes. I think we are so early in these cycles that the terminology is a little confused. Deep fakes to some, synthetic media to others. But for the purposes of this conversation, I think we are talking about not just video, but could be, audio in particular, which, as you know, is actually much harder to detect and probably in many ways easier to use to fool people. Sandra, let's come to you. So at Mandiant, this is what you do all day, is look at the risks and the threats. So what are you most concerned about?
Well, we often say that, Mandiant is on the so-called front lines of the threat because we respond to breaches around the world. And we also do a lot of monitoring of adversary infrastructure. And some of the things that we've been seeing are quite alarming, but they're in a sort of, I would call them in a nascent stage, experimental stage, on a couple of fronts. So I asked my team to please go and tell me exactly what threat actors are doing with AI right now. Because, we've seen the movies, we understand what everybody is afraid of. And they came back and said they're using, AI for, these fake images to propagate information operations. We're seeing a lot of that. Everybody is sort of in tune to that. They're also in the underground selling access to so-called jailbreak versions of some of the chatbots that we see. So for $199 a month, you can have access to maybe an API with more restriction or less restrictions than the actual platform. This is unreliable because these are cyber criminals and others that we're talking about. So right now, we haven't responded to a single incident or breach where AI was a factor in the 1,000 that we do a year. So what it seems to me is that we're in this, pre-AI phase still. where the impact has not fully reached its potential. But that is not for lack of trying on the part of adversaries. We track a group since 2019 called Dragon Bridge, and this is a group that started out as conducting information operations against Hong Kong protesters. They were doing it in Chinese and in English, and over the last few years, we've seen them grow to, they're platform agnostic. There are over 10 languages now on 30 different social media platforms, and they're spewing narratives that are anti-democracy, anti-US, anti-NATO, and they continue to put these narratives out. One of their videos, which YouTube took down, but it was basically a video showing images of the January 6th attack on the Capitol, how people shouldn't vote, that's not how you solve problems, and the final line was, the only way to really solve problems is to decapitate the system from the head. And that was the narrative that was being put out, very anti-democracy, playing on the rift and division that was already in the American political landscape. So the quantity is out there. The quantity of these information operations, the effect is not fully at its maximum. We are not seeing it create the effects, but they're trying, and they're getting better and more numerous, and our team is growing because the threat continues to get better and better at what they do.
I want to just pick up on something you mentioned, because I think it's important when we talk about what is new about AI that is not just sort of more of the same, again, going back to Gutenberg's printing press. And you mentioned multiple languages. And the power of AI to be able to reach people easily in both text and audio is very significant and now made available and accessible to anybody. So.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those things where these tools that are actually have a wonderful intent to be able to be that, from that universal translator that we watched in sci-fi growing up, it's here, right? The real-time translation where I could be speaking now and I simulcast my voice in Mandarin with the exact, translation. So in the best sense, that is a wonderful tool to bring people together and enable the non-English speaking world. But of course, as many things, it can be abused by threat actors to create inauthentic content. And I think that that's the place where we have our question is going to be, how can governments prepare their populations or inform their populations to understand that, like for many years, one of the elements of warfare and conflict has always been the control of the information space and the hearts and minds of the population you're trying to defend. And we are the targets now, and we've always been in this type of thing, but the scale that AI creates is the new part, the scale and the access.
David, I'm going to turn to you. So, as the director of threat disruption, I'm very curious what you have seen and maybe disrupted from elections that we've seen. We've seen a bunch of recent elections that I rattled off at the top of this session, and other sort of recent conflict in news. What you're seeing that is AI generated, what you see going into or polluting the information ecosystem, and how you're addressing it.
And maybe just to start to echo some of what Olga and Sandra had mentioned, it's just as important what we're not seeing. And I think what we're not seeing is a lot of those really highly developed AI-enabled influence operations. What we generally see when AI is involved in the I/O space, as Sandra mentioned, is maybe fake profile photos being created on, and not even in the top-of-the-line image generation models, but on things like this person does not exist.net or whatever, which dates back by years, has very obvious telltale signs of issues. And at the moment, it's not clear that those tactics are meaningfully changing the ability for defenders to identify these campaigns. If anything, using these low-quality GAN-generated photos in some cases is a hallmark that something's inauthentic. When you see misplaced ears or 6 fingers, it's pretty obvious that the account isn't actually a person. Now, that doesn't mean that down the road, as image generation models get better, as consumer adoption increases, those risks won't manifest. But it is notable that it isn't something that's really shown up yet. What we are seeing, and I think something, given the audience we have here, is really important, is in some ways, as defenders at tech companies and government and civil society, the research community, have gotten better at finding these operations. It's forced these campaigns to do two key things. One is nebulized across the internet. And so we're seeing almost a callback to things that you see from traditional cyber actors, relying on, for example, web domains that can host malware or host influence operations content that isn't easily taken down by any individual social media platform. It enables persistence that we haven't seen before, where before you might have 100 accounts run by the IRA on Facebook, you might now have 100 websites or 5,000 websites like we saw with the doppelganger operation from Russia. That makes it harder for defenders to kind of comprehensively defend the entire ecosystem. And the second thing is a callback to traditional intelligence methods, right? Moving operations that in 2016, 2018, 2020 were online into the offline space. So on one hand, we're looking at these new capabilities from AI-enabled systems. On the other hand, we're seeing, for example, Russian proxy groups go back to the Cold War playbook, run operations through cutouts, run operations through third parties or third-party countries. That makes the job of defenders significantly harder, because oftentimes, Facebook, Meta, we don't and shouldn't have visibility into offline intelligence operations activity. So I think that's maybe the really notable piece in terms of tactics, is that we're certainly alert to the threat that some of the emerging technologies pose, but we can't take our eye off the ball of kind of the old tried and true practices that these operators use. One other thing I wanted to catch on as well, since you'd mentioned Dragon Bridge, is another trend in particular as we look towards the US elections later this year, and a number of elections in Europe coming up relatively soon, is increased clandestine activity from Chinese influence operation actors. I think we've seen, in the past when I used to do talks like this, we would talk about how Chinese influence activity was overwhelmingly overt. Right, it was through state-controlled media entities, particularly on our platforms, or in Chinese on Chinese language platforms. And just in the last 2 years, we've seen considerably more Chinese clandestine operations targeting English language audiences outside of China's immediate environs. So that's, I think, a trend we're really alert to, is that the increasing kind of brazenness of Chinese I/O across the internet.
Speaking of China, Theo, TikTok is particularly is ginormous, has an enormous influence, particularly has an influence with young people, many of whom are early in their voting careers or new voters. So I want to ask you, how do you see your role in terms of protecting the integrity of election information that young TikTok users are getting, given what we know from recent studies about how some issues around current events, like we've seen around Israel and Gaza, have been particularly focused in one point of view and not necessarily another?
Okay, there's a lot there. There's China,
no, I know
Israel, Gaza.
I know, I threw it all in there.
So I'm not going to try and answer all of that in one question. I'm just going to try and follow this conversation, and then I'm happy to come back on any of that. Okay. Let me give you one example of the threat that we've already seen, which was the mayor of London. There was an audio fake. This was cheap and nasty. It wasn't sophisticated. It also wasn't run by a big state-sponsored network. It was a far-right group. It was an individual in his bedroom, and it spread. And the Met Police and the mayor of London got in contact with all the platforms, and we were able to identify that audio and find that signature and make sure we remove it before it even appears on our platforms. And that's what we do, and that's straightforward to do. But the difficult thing is there is an echo, there is an imprint left behind, because what you see is the chatter around people saying, did you see that thing? It's been taken down. And then that's where you have, you're already talking about conspiracy theories here. And then these people are saying, it's been taken down by the deep state because it's true. So one thing is identifying the actor, one thing is removing it, the other thing is, so it's not just disinformation, misinformation, but it's how do we build trust on the platform. So that's one of the things that we think about as we head into this mega election year. So in Europe, we will have a mission control in Dublin. So Dublin is our global center for trust and safety. We have 40,000 people working to keep the platform safe. We have 6,000 moderators in Europe. We will have an election center within the app in every one of the EU 27 member states. And within that, we will be providing information and be able to direct people towards trusted sources. So when we do see those kinds of attacks or misinformation, we can make sure that when people are coming on the platform looking for that content, they're directed to something positive. And it's true we do have a younger user base than some of our competitors, but our average age is over 30 now, so we are voters. And
old.
And it's not just the kids. Yeah.
Do you want to talk about China? We might as well just get into that right now.
Yeah. Do you want to ask me a question or just, I mean, I'm not here to defend China, so.
Yeah. I'm happy to ask you a question.
Yeah.
I thought it'd be easier to just say China, go. But I'm happy to ask you the question. So, of course, a lot of people are concerned about how much control, how much access China has to user data, to the nature of what content is being surfaced on the apps, and general sort of skeptical about the independence that you may have, or those that are running TikTok outside of China may have from the CCP. I'm sure you're going to say that it's all fine, but help us find comfort in that information.
Yeah, okay, let me try. So well, maybe the first thing I would just say is, we have also seen networks from China attempting to manipulate and carry out covert influence operations on our platform. We published that, I think, in our most recent last transparency report. We act in the same way as the other platforms in detecting and being transparent about this on a quarterly basis. So TikTok was founded by a Chinese person. TikTok's parent company, ByteDance, is not a Chinese company. It is incorporated outside of China. There is no CCP board member on the parent company. Our ownership model is we are about 60% owned by big global investors, same investors that invested in the other companies on this panel. About 20% by employees, thousands of them here in Europe, and about 20% by the Chinese founders. So our sort of Chinese segment is 20%, which is about the same as Mercedes, as I understand. So, but obviously I say that somewhat flippantly. There is a concern about TikTok because we have a big operation in China, and specifically because of Chinese national security laws. And I'm not here to defend Chinese national security laws, but the way we think about it is there's two potential insider threats within our company that we have to go beyond every other company in showing that we can protect and guard against. One is, can the CCP somehow access data? And the second is, can the CCP somehow manipulate content? On the first, we have two major projects, one in the US called Project Texas and one in Europe called Project Clover. I'll just talk about Project Clover because I'm the European side and we're in Europe, but it's the same broad principles. We're putting all of our European user data onto data centers in Europe, 2 in Ireland, 1 in Norway. We have a barrier around that data so that access to that data from within the company, any data coming out from that barrier within the company has to come through secure gateways. Access to that secure gateway, like every other company, is restricted on the basis of who's accessing the data, what type of data, for what reason, for how long, and so on and so on. And then the big difference between what we do and what everyone else does is we have a third party provide that gateway and provide the oversight. So in the US, that is Oracle. In Europe, that is the NCC group. I'm assuming people here will know who the NCC group is, but normally I have to explain who they are. But they are a very highly respected cybersecurity firm. So they have also written into the contract, the NCC group, that they can come and talk to national cybersecurity authorities in Europe and in the UK without TikTok in the room. So if there is something that the UK National Cybersecurity Centre are concerned about, they can talk to NCC Group to investigate it without us being in the room. That's how we're protecting and keeping data secure from that insider threat risk. Then the other side of it is, how do you protect against manipulation or influence on the algorithm? And that's a hard one to disprove, because you're trying to disprove something that's a fear or suspicion, but which there isn't evidence of. But the way that we do this is in two ways. One way is the same as everyone else. We have API access for researchers, so people can come and look and investigate and see, was there something funny happening with the algorithm? But the second that no one else does is we have literally given all of our source code to 2 other companies to inspect, and they can inspect that source code. Just to be doubly sure that we didn't give one version of the source code to them and a different version of the source code to Apple and Google, Oracle will submit the app to the App Store. So we are also open to what further steps can we take in order to tackle this cybersecurity threat. But we are fully committed to that.
Thanks. All right, well, we'll leave it there, and if others, when we want to come back to questions, are welcome to ask you more questions about the China relationship. But I want to come back more specifically. I've really heard almost all of you kind of almost downplaying the impact of AI on election integrity, election information, suggesting rightfully that the existing problems before generative AI sort of took off like a rocket ship after the release of ChatGPT, that really we should just, it's the same old, same old. But I mean, other than say language, the ability to translate easily, instantaneously, simultaneously under language. Is that what you're saying, David? You really kind of downplayed it. Are you not seeing any new risks across the globe?
So I think if we zoom out a bit from just the clandestine influence operations problem set. So in the clandestine influence space, not generally right now. Scams and fraud, which a few people have mentioned, absolutely a problem that scammers and spammers and the people sending you phishing and spear phishing emails can write significantly more convincing bank copy than they could before, and do it much more quickly. However, I think there are some broader questions about norms and regulation if we just look at elections vis-a-vis AI, some of which are being written right now. If we look at, for example, the Israel-Gaza situation, there have been a few times where people have made claims backed up by images generated by generative AI tools that were then very quickly proven to be images from generative AI tools that undermined the underlying claim. That was likely not their intent. But we're kind of creating, and maybe not the best way to do this, but we're creating some of these norms around what happens when you deploy images or video or audio created by a generative AI system as those things occur. And they seem to be somewhat counterintuitive, that if you use fake imagery and you get found out, everything else you said is suddenly suspect, even if it was in fact grounded in fact. The second challenge is, and this has been an ongoing discussion around elections, is what is acceptable behavior for campaigns, for politicians, for advocacy groups, vis-a-vis new technology? A few years back, the German federal elections, last time I was in Munich, 2019, there was a discussion around whether campaigns in Germany should sign up to a compact saying that they wouldn't do disinformation in the election. Now, the compact didn't end up happening, which is unfortunate. But some of the onus on how these tools get used and what the effects of using them are do belong to other parts of the information ecosystem. Olga referenced the landline telephone calls and cell phone robocalls. I think if we do look ecosystem-wide, there will be generative AI tools deployed in the election. The question is whether we have the right stakeholders in the room to be really discussing what those effects are going to be, and if those stakeholders really need to include campaigns, electoral officials, journalistic organizations, similar to some of the discussions in 2020.
And whether we can see them at all. Right. I mean, the ability, the new ability to be able to generate highly targeted voice messaging via good old landline, using AI to say, David, we know that your polling place at Bannockburn Elementary School. There's been a flood, so please show up at this other location. Voting will be moved to Wednesday. That kind of thing. I mean, some people will not be fooled by that, but some will.
In something that that there have been discussions about in the disinfo community is, what is the responsibility for companies that are releasing models to, for example, watermark content? Something that I know Meta's talked a lot about is, as we release tools to the public, making sure that those tools, for example, our image generation tools, do watermark images to ensure that there's some continuity there. Now, the problem is there will always be players that don't sign up to what everyone else is doing. But
and there's
the more
open
we
source
can
models
create,
too, which are not,
And the more we can create those expectations, the better.
Sandra, I just want to come back to you to talk a little bit go a little bit deeper about these AI risks, particularly the ones that we cannot see. There's been a lot of hype, and I'm going to come back to you on this in a minute, Olga. There's been a lot of hype about the big, spectacular deep fake, which certainly will happen. In the United States, it'll be either Trump or Biden, falling over, or who knows what. Nobody's going to be, well, unless it happens, for real, nobody's going to be fooled by that. It's this, again, the stuff we can't see. It's the anonymous voice, not the Biden voice we have to worry about. How do you detect that?
Well, there are a lot of surprises that pop up around election time. And, I never saw coming, for example, that an Iranian-based group was going to send emails out impersonating the Proud Boys, right-wing group and trying to intimidate voters and putting out a video with Metallica, right? So I admit it, we didn't see that coming. I thought it'd be Led Zeppelin, but, so, we know there are going to be tricks, that we know there are going to be manipulations, but a lot of this is the same methods, and I think AI is simply going to be another tool in this space. So, for example, we're tracking right now a new group we've never seen before. We believe it is a Russian-based group that is combining some of the espionage techniques with some information operations. We call it Uncategorized Group 5105. We use this naming schema when we don't know who it is. It's an uncategorized group. Now, the reason that we care about this is because in the past, groups that combine information operations and espionage tend to do the types of things like hack and leak, right? So will we see hack and leak campaigns? There is a very good chance we're going to see something like that mixed in inauthentic content with authentic content to try to drive and confuse, voters. Now, I think, again, AI is a tool that can enable some scale, that can enable these, but this is let's say, a methodology that we're just continuing to see. AI is going to enable it further.
Nick, you were speaking earlier about that there's not really a big market for detection technology necessarily. And yet the need is so critical. I've heard a lot of skepticism out in the world, in my travels, that really there will be effective detection tools, particularly not so much, we hear a lot about sort of watermarking technologies, but again, particularly when we're dealing with voice and not necessarily images or video. Is it even possible? Do you think these technologies, that there can be effective technologies that will make it easily identifiable when something is synthetic media?
It's a great question. My best guess is that it will be an arms race, like a lot of areas of cybersecurity. I think an interesting thing about the problem today is that AI is not sufficient to solve it alone. There are dozens of digital forensic techniques that are required to detect deepfakes. But I do think we'll make very significant progress over the next 5 to 10 years. And I do think a large enterprise market will emerge that will lead to a lot of investment in new technologies. On the broader risk, I would lean forward a little bit further maybe than some previous comments, and they have much more visibility into many of the risks, which is to say that if you've got the same bad actors, a very high stakes election, and radically more powerful tools, there's a reasonable chance those tools are going to be used, and used in a way that we may not anticipate or be broadcast now. I think if you had a panel here in 2015 on social media, and someone were to ask, is social media a threat to this upcoming election? I think people would probably rightly say, we haven't seen anything, and there hasn't, we don't really have any data to lead us to worry. And it was a failure of imagination, and it was a very creative set of attacks at the same time. So I think it's rational to be reasonably nervous at the moment.
Yeah, I share that nervous. We just don't know what we don't know at this point. Olga, I'm going to come back to you with then we're going to open it up to questions. Come back to you to just follow on something that you said in your opening remarks, which is the whole, for some bad actors, the whole point is not to get you to believe any individual piece of falsified information, but to get you to believe in nothing at all. And, we know this, many of us now know this as the liar's dividend. Thank you, Professors Chesney and Citron. I always want to give them credit. They came up with that term. It did not appear out of thin air. How big, I mean, I will stipulate that this is perhaps my biggest concern, which is when folks, because there's so much hype around AI, and so much, look out, there's all these fakes out there, it's going to be very easy to say, you know, I don't believe anything. How big a threat is that, and how do we mitigate that?
So first I'll explain for those of you that are unfamiliar with this concept of the liar's dividend. David was alluding to it a little bit in his remarks, but the idea is, you know, let's say the Access Hollywood tapes come out today, how does someone react, right? The politician would react by saying, that's fake. That was created, that's not my voice, that's fake audio, right? And that creates an opportunity for politicians to sort of not take accountability for something that may actually be real information. And so when we are, you know, creating this information environment where there's a lot of distrust, you know, let's look back to sort of the evolution of this problem set between 2016 and 2020 as well. And, you know, the conversation in post-2016 was a lot about the particular tactics of threat actors, the kinds of content they produce, the ways in which they develop networks, how troll farms are run, and policies, you know, were developed by different tech companies to deal with that. You fast forward to 2018, and you know, one of the sort of less talked about, but something that I got a chance to work on when I was working on that election was this. What, you know, we called perception hacking, similar to liar's dividend. This idea that you know, the troll farm was no longer interested, the Internet Research Agency in particular, in pushing any particular narratives, focusing on divisive issues in society, but rather on posting a website that was usaira.ru. So not hiding, but not hiding even further, because if you looked at the domain registration information of that website, it was Azimut LLC, which is one of the 13 indicted companies that was involved and connected to the Internet Research Agency, right? It was screaming, look at us, and in fact it was screaming because on the website in all caps it said, we are the Internet Research Agency, your governments and technology companies are powerless against this threat, we've interfered, right? But the reality was that the whole society approach was actually useful at the time because the FBI had tipped off technology companies to that website. There was joint press releases that's, you know, the networks were taken down before they actually had any impact or were able to build a following. But they still wanted to claim success for what they were able to accomplish. And that kind of tells you everything that they were trying to do, right? It wasn't about actually interfering, but it was getting people to believe that they had. And that's where I think we haven't really talked about this, and often, you know, when you're involved in conversations in Europe or in other places, it's safer to put the F in front of FIMI. It's safer to put the F in front of the FIDF, right? Foreign, rather than just focusing on interference and manipulation overall. Because when I worked at Meta, you know, we saw this rise of domestic influence operations around the world, and they weren't necessarily from state-sponsored actors. They were from, you know, all kinds of individuals and organizations. And then outside of the threat actors that are manipulating, there's also the misinformed public, right? People who just don't know any better. And those people are going to be, you know, using the tools that are available to them to ask questions. They're going to be resharing information that they don't know isn't true. And how do we distinguish between dealing with that problem, which is a content problem, and also a societal problem, right? And I think Sandra was alluding to this, right? Some of these technologies and tools are used by threat actors, but ultimately, we can anticipate new threats, but one of the things I've sort of learned no longer working in a tech company is I played years of whack-a-mole, right? Take down the bad guys, right? More pop-up, take down the bad guys. But you also have to create sort of a fundamental trust in institutions and society, in journalism, build up local journal, the sort of foundational important things that protect people and enable them with the critical thinking skills that they can use to then do something about that fake that they saw.
Excellent. Well, you will not get any argument from me that more and high quality journalism is the answer to everything. We have time for just a couple of questions. Anybody? Wow. Oh, sorry. Oh, you're right in front of me. Go ahead. I have a question. Oh, wait for the mic.
Thanks. I have a question to Theo and David. What are Meta's and TikTok's response to Europe's new Digital Services Act, which impose fines on companies? Do you plan to comply with it? Do you want to dispute it?
We're both regulated, so the answer for both is going to be yes. But yeah, I think it's a good thing that we have I mean, Germany actually sort of had NetzDG before every other country had laws in this area, and I think it's a good thing that Europe has introduced them. I think DSA, I think, is a pretty good approach. I'm sure, as we saw with GDPR, the privacy equivalent, I think that this will also evolve in future and further improve. But I think it's a pretty good start.
Very short answer, yes, right? We're a company who operate in Europe. We operate by the regulations in Europe as well. And I also think it's important to note, DSA, GDPR, as you mentioned, these are also important roadmaps for tackling some of the problems we're talking about. Just yesterday, we released a report on spyware. In that report, we talk about the importance of GDPR as a way of tackling abuse of spyware in Europe. And so I think that there are opportunities here even beyond just technology companies to think about how Europe can lead in this space.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, there's a question over here, and that'll come to you, Catherine. Just in the back. We have time for just 2 questions. Your question, and I'll come to you.
I'll be quick. So I'm with the Linux Foundation, and we're working on the C2PA content credentials. Is that a solution that you think can help with fake media?
Anybody want to take that? I couldn't actually hear your question, so can you repeat it?
Okay, I asked if you think that content credentials are basically identifying that media are originally from the author that claims it. Can that be a solution to fighting fake media?
Go ahead.
Somewhat familiar. So I think that it is one potential solution. I think one of the things that's somewhat exciting about the time that we're in vis-a-vis AI and content generation capabilities is that we're still in the laboratory to see what works. Authenticating authentic media is, I think, a really important potential tool. The challenge will be as we start to encounter adversarial use cases and how one controls, for example, that authentication. But broadly, yes, it's something that I know our teams are somewhat engaged, or hoping to be engaged on as well.
Okay. Oh, go ahead.
I would try and say this delicately. Sometimes it's not the unverified accounts that are the sources of misinformation.
That was said very delicately and very, very clearly. Catherine, I'm just going to do the Oprah thing, or I don't know who does that. Go ahead.
Just a quick one. Many people in my country are retreating into the encrypted messaging apps like WhatsApp because they can share information with trusted groups. Is there any possibility of taking down content there? Because maybe that's where it retreats to if you take it down from other channels.
I think that's a question to you, David.
The short answer is yes, right? So on one hand, end-to-end encryption communication channels is something I personally feel are very important for people to be able to have access to. At the same time, and I think WhatsApp has actually innovated in a few of these places, you have to give people tools to avoid abuse, avoid harassment wherever you can. So in WhatsApp, people can report content that they feel violates our terms of service, and that content can then get reviewed without breaking the fundamental encryption between the communication. It's also possible, I think there's a bunch of really important conversations going on about how to ensure that conversations about, for example, countering disinformation, misinformation, or other online harms don't stray into a place where we start trying to fundamentally weaken encryption, given, I think, all of us are cybersecurity professionals, the benefits that encryption provides in cybersecurity space more broadly.
Okay, great. Well, we are over time, so David, Theo, Olga, Sandra, Nick, thank you so much. Thank you to all of you, and I turn it over to you, yeah? Okay.